Hello, and welcome to episode 144 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kalorn in Napa Valley, California.
I have a very personal question for you today, Dave. How's the weather up there? Personal because I'm going to be there soon and I need to know.
You'll be here in a week, man.
That's right.
It is overcast and like mid-60s, so I suppose in some parts of the country that's a warm summer's day, but here it's a little bit grim and gloomy.
I like it a little grim and gloomy. I think it's the Brit in me or something. Give me overcast, give me 4 p.m. sunsets.
Yeah, I don't like it.
I know you don't. But I'm a guest, so I get to pick.
We'll see about that.
We will. What are you drinking today?
Well, I was just in Canada, of all places. I went up to Vancouver, which is a very cool town. Very much liked it. Incredible scenery there. Ocean, mountains, you name it. But I was in one of the stores and I discovered that Rockstar, which is usually an energy drink, created a thing called punched vodka, which is an alcoholic version of their energy drink. And I don't know that you can get it in the U.S., probably.
I've never heard of it.
But I at least saw it in Canada. And so I grabbed a few of those and brought them back. I don't know if that's legal or not, but I did it.
We've confessed worse things on this. So I think you're okay.
Yeah, it ties perfectly into the music that I've chosen today. So for me, it's a Rockstar punched vodka.
There you go. Yeah, I've got vodka too, because I think you suggested you found some new vodka. That's the most details I've heard about it. For me, it's just a vodka sugar-free Red Bull. So in terms of exotics, you win this round. Tell us how that ties into the song, though, because there's a cool story here.
I don't know if it's cool.
Well,
most people won't think so. I like it, though. On Thursday night, I went down to the Fillmore in San Francisco, which, of course, is a legendary venue, and saw the Struts play, and they got a new album out, and one of the singles on that album that I really like is called Rockstar. And that by itself would be cause to choose that song, because I love that band. They're fantastic. And just having seen them. But we're going to talk about admissions questions. And part of the whole process of applying to law school when you go through the application process is to make yourself look like a rock star.
Yeah.
So I think it ties in pretty well. I got the drink. I got the song. I'm feeling good.
Yeah, you're the whole package today. I'll put one slight side note in here that a lot of times when we do these music choices, we do them kind of as an in memoriam because someone has typically died from the generation of music that you and I prefer. In this case, it happened to be Shane MacGowan. So we didn't pick a Pogue song, but I will give a hat tip to Shane. He was a rock star.
He was a partier, I think is what I said to you earlier.
That is exactly what you said to me earlier.
Not my favorite band.
I find them hard to distinguish at times. Not my favorite either. Although, rest in peace, Shane.
If you like a slurry mess, that's the Pogues.
I prefer a slurry mess.
Let's go to the LSAT world, man.
Let's do it. So, where to begin? I suppose we should talk about some test dates. We get this month off, blessedly, but there is kind of a fast and furious run at the very beginning of next year with a January and February test. The January registration just ended last week. So if you haven't signed up for January 2024, I'm afraid you missed the window. The dates of that test just announced. It's another 4-day adventure. It begins on Wednesday, January 10th, and runs through, I guess, what would be Saturday, January 13th. Scores come out the last day of the month, Wednesday the 31st. So buckle up, man. We just went through this in November. We'll have another 4 days in January. It's a lot to deal with. February, so far, is both still open. You've got until the day after Christmas, Tuesday the 26th of December, to sign up for February. And so far, it's only a 2-day test, Friday and Saturday the 9th and 10th of that month. Scores also come out, this is not a leap year, so they come out the last day of February as well, 28th, which is a Wednesday. You think they'll expand that test to more days, Dave?
Not based on the numbers right now, which I'll actually address in just a second, but the numbers for February aren't suggesting that it would be a 4-day test yet. We'll have to watch them, though.
Yeah, January wasn't a 4-day test until about, a week or so ago, so we shall see.
Let's talk about that because the situation with January is actually kind of interesting. If you look at the final numbers for November, there were about 25,600 people that were registered for that test. Right now, the registration numbers for January are 32,300. So it's looking larger than November.
Yeah, it's huge.
That will change. It will come down. There's always this kind of melting away, this attrition rate that occurs. And so January will drop as people kind of like get information back or decide they don't want to take the test or push it till later. But you can see why they moved it to 4 days, because the numbers are looking really robust. I mean, that's over 20,000 test takers. That usually is when they try to like trip out with 3 or 4 days. February, by comparison right now, shows 4,588 test takers. So just, considerably smaller. We'll watch that as the registration goes on. Maybe they'll add a day, but they can handle that with 2 test days, no problem at all. They can double the size of that and handle it with 2 test days. It's once it goes over 10,000, I think maybe they start thinking about it, maybe 12,000. Depends on what they're doing. But it does lead to an interesting question about the cycle in general. Anybody who follows me on Twitter knows that last week I posted that after being in a deficit with applicants for the new cycle here, we are now in a surplus, meaning there are now more applicants than there were last year. In fact, there's 3.7% more applicants for this cycle currently than last year. And when you take a look at the January numbers, there's no suggestion that that's going to fall off. It looks like it'll probably grow even more. And if you are applying this year and you're kind of putting your apps in now or it's coming up, what that's telling you is that there's going to be more competition for what is likely the same spots. Now, schools can expand their class size. They won't do that anymore, though, if it costs them numbers, if their LSAT averages go down or their GPA averages go down, because it has been a war the last several years of very high GPAs, very high LSATs. It's almost at a ridiculous level. But if you are in that group, especially if you're looking at the very top schools, a really interesting thing is happening at the top, which is that the scores from 165 to 180 are down overall. So even though we have 3.7% more applicants, we've got several percentage points down in those regions. So more applicants, but fewer at the high levels of scoring. And these kinds of things can change, and it moves around a little bit. But we'll have to watch that situation. It is narrowing a little bit from even the last time I checked it, and certainly narrowing from what it was a month ago. So it may converge to kind of like being flat, but if there are more applicants, that still means it's down relatively.
Right. My suspicion with January, where you tend to get people with a bit more experience under their belt, is that it's going to bump some of those higher score numbers back up. For our students, it's great news, assuming they're part of that cohort. For others, I know that's a scary prospect because things are already so competitive at the high levels here. For instance, we talk a lot about rankings in some of these podcasts. I don't think I've ever seen so much volatility in the top 10 to 14 schools as we have in the last year or two. Largely, in my estimation, due to the competitiveness of people in that range. I think we're going to see more of it in the next 2 months.
Yeah, if you talking just rankings, obviously they made some ranking system changes.
Oh, there's that too.
Also the fact that there's just a lot of good applicants out there. And it's something that we'll touch on a little bit because a number of the questions that we've received over the past few weeks relate to the quality of application and little things that people can do to improve their position. But I'll tell you, if you're taking that January LSAT, John, we're just about to talk about the webinars that we always offer. We would definitely invite you to come join us for the Crystal Ball. That will cover both the January and February LSATs. And I'm going to lead with that discussion because in this case, we've made a date change.
Yeah.
The Crystal Ball was originally scheduled for 2 days from tonight, so Wednesday, 12/6. We've changed that date, and I'll explain why in a moment, to Tuesday, 12/12. So December 12th now. It is still 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. And if you need to register for that, you can go to powerscore.com/free seminars. Got a bunch of seminars there about the LSAT in general, but also the Crystal Ball with John and I is there. And John, I hate to admit it, but I am the sole cause of why the Crystal Ball date has changed.
Well, let me ease your mind at least a little bit. I'm grateful for the extra 6 days, buddy. Both because it gives me more time with the somewhat newly released PT94, which data will be included about in this next session. And I don't know, I like to tinker with these slides to the last minute. You've now given me a lot more last minutes, so thank you.
Yeah, and of course, you and I like to fool around with the content all the time. So it looks like this time, John, I think I'll be opening this webinar, whereas you've opened the last couple of ones. I think the last one I opened was the June mini ball.
Right, that's right.
So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like doing the lead-off hitting duty. But let me explain why it is that we've moved the date. And it's not because I forgot something that was going on or, my daughter playing in the orchestra at school. I got a note from PG&E, which is Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the primary utility for Californians, saying, oh, by the way, we're doing some fire suppression work, even though fire season is basically past here. And we're going to turn your power off on, December 6th. They gave me 1 week notice on that, which I don't appreciate. But instead of waiting to see whether or not they'd turn the power back on in time for me to show up, I said, let's just go ahead and change it. So I will take the full blame for that being the case. And I'm sorry for all people affected.
You'll get no blame.
However,
get no blame from me, at least. I can't speak to anyone.
Yes. Here's the good news. If you can't make it, sign up anyway. We will send you a link that will give you access to the recording so you can watch it at any point thereafter. We've made it free to the public. There's no cost for it. I can tell you based upon the past, 2 to 3 years of us doing this, our accuracy is really good. And if it hits, it can be like a gold mine of information for test takers. We get messages every test now where it's just like, thank God I read that. You guys really helped me out. So even if you can't make it, sign up and we'll make sure you get a copy of that recording so you can view it on your own.
Well, there we go. All right. I am excited for that. And I'll have about a day to pack and then come see you.
That's right, man. And then we'll go taste some wine, talk some LSAT. It'll be a good time.
Definitely in that order. Yes.
I don't know if that's a winning combination or a losing combination. We're going to drink some wine and talk LSAT. Yay.
Yay.
we are really partying.
So
all right.
Let's get to the meat of this, because we're going to talk about something that I know is on everyone's mind, especially this time of year. This is going to be admissions-centric as we go through this mailbag. We are getting just an avalanche of student questions about admissions stuff. So let's dive in. Let's see what's been on people's minds and see if maybe we can give some good advice here before the wine starts flowing.
And a lot of the kind of the questions that we have pulled this time have come in through our admissions consulting department. The manager there, when she goes through kind of like the requests and she's sending it to various people, she takes a look at what people are asking and oftentimes gives us a highlight so we have a sense of like the most commonly asked questions. And we've pulled a few of those. Not all of them though, but many of them come from the admissions consulting people that work with us. And right now, even if you're looking to apply and you want to go through the process of getting some additional professional help, I think the top line package that we have has got a pretty big discount on it. It's like $1,000 off the full application package. But let's take a look at the first question that we have floating around out here. It actually came in via an email. And the question is how much does an advanced degree impact admissions? This person is thinking about dropping out of a program that they are in, but they also don't want to hurt their chances for law school by dropping out. Mm-hmm. And John, this really has two questions, inherent in it is, what's the value of a graduate degree or even a PhD in applying to law school? So let's address that first. I mean, the question is it a negative? No, obviously not. Is it a huge, overwhelming positive? I'm sorry to say, typically not either.
We've touched on this idea before, that law schools, I think largely for the sake of just having some sort of unifying comparison point, tend not to pay much attention to graduate performance, graduate degrees. And there's a second aspect to it too, which is that I think for most graduate programs, the grade inflation is so just extreme, really, that it's hard to look at a graduate GPA with the same kind of perspective and the same kind of like weight that you would look at an undergrad, where things seem to be a little bit more both uniform and I think fair, equitable.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the whole thing is first off, sometimes people come in and they say, I had a 2.0 undergraduate, but I have a 4.0 graduate degree. And a lot of times what we have to tell them is that 4.0 won't count. They don't factor it in. It's not going to offset your 2.0 in a direct way. And in an indirect way, it's nice. They know you did well. But graduate degrees, as you said, are often thought to have grade inflation. So it doesn't have a huge impact as well. Here's how it plays out, though. It's great to have the graduate degree. It shows that you're really interested in what you're doing. So I think that's a positive. It'll never hurt you to have additional education when you're applying to an educational institution. The other part of this question, though, was like, I'm thinking about dropping out. there's concerns there. If you're dropping out, then I have a little bit of a worry because a law school might look at that and say, well, why would they just drop out if they're not happy after 6 or 12 months here? When retention is a huge thing to law school, so they want to see commitment. So in this person's case, it's like, well, your advanced degree will help. But if you're thinking about dropping out, be very careful and have a really good reason for it, because it will look as if you don't really know what you want and you're not 18 anymore at this point. So you don't get the benefit of like, I was still learning who I was. I give a lot of latitude to people and say, hey, anything you do before 30 really is impermanent. But the law schools don't have quite the same generosity that I do.
This is true. What law schools tend to do, and what I often do when I look at applicants too, is try to spot trends, patterns of credentials, performance, behavior, dropping out of your most recent educational attempts. And that really does send some red flags, doesn't it? So the number that you get GPA-wise may not matter. Pulling out halfway through it could.
Yeah, so let's go to the second part of this question, which I thought was also interesting. It addresses both GPA and LSAT, which we're going to talk a little bit about more, but it also has a really broad aspect to it that I liked. And the question is how much does a high LSAT score compensate for a good but not great GPA? I graduated around 2020, had about a 3.5, 3.6, right in the middle there. To get into a top 10 school, would a 170 LSAT or better be enough?
Okay, I'll take it. You left this pregnant pause, which I'll see if I can fill.
That's because I had to cough.
Oh, I didn't even say that part. I just thought you were waiting on me, as usual.
No.
Well, here's the good news. You said this before, and I thought it was a nice preface to this, that you can't really offset or compensate for a low undergrad GPA with a high grad GPA, but you can absolutely compensate for a low undergrad GPA with a great LSAT score. So the first half of this question, before we start to try to predict their admissions odds, the first half of this question is pretty straightforward. An LSAT score is the thing that matters most to schools still. And it's really the one thing that you can actually influence and improve, especially if you have a low GPA. So if you're that type of splitter, as they're called.
Yeah. High LSAT score, low GPA is a splitter. If you reverse it, high GPA, low LSAT score, typically reverse splitter.
Yeah.
The thing I'll say about this is, it's the one thing that can offset it. Will it offset it at schools that are in the top 10? It'll get you in consideration because they're going to look at high LSAT scores. But the problem is that 3.5, 3.6 is going to be below the 25th percentile for a lot of schools. It's hard to overcome that. And so if you don't have that score in the 170s, well, you're just dead for sure in terms of your applications. So going out and getting that high LSAT score at least gives you a shot to get in the running. And hopefully there are other things in your application. In other words, you need to have it if you're even trying to think about those T14, T20 schools in that particular level. Without it, if you have both a low GPA and a low or kind of like mid-level LSAT, according to their medians, you are so far behind the eight ball, you better have some kind of incredible story going on. And most people, they have great stories, but to have like 1 in a million is not that common in terms of how it stands out.
Yeah, I'll reiterate too, this was a question specific about schools in the top 10. So when we talk about like without a 170 plus LSAT score, you're in real trouble. It's specific to that range of schools. A lot of people a lot of people go to great law schools with scores in the 150s and do well. 170 is not a mandatory thing for law school, but in a top 10, especially with a low GPA, it probably is a necessity.
Yeah, that's good for you to highlight that because this question was about a top 10 law school. If we're starting to talk about top 100, I'm like, 170 will definitely get you in a bunch of places with a 3.5, 3.6.
I didn't want anybody to hear that one sound bite and be like, why bother?
I'm out.
Yeah.
Let's keep on talking about GPA a little bit. And this was a question that was sent to, really it was included as a consultant request. Consultants usually don't ask us questions about it, but we see the questions they get asked. It informs things. This is actually one of the favorite questions I've seen in a while because I think it speaks a little bit to the idea of like, well, I've worked hard at a good school. I should get some just, desserts from that. It says, I would like to discuss the context of how my GPA is seen since I went to a top-tier undergraduate institution. Is it really seen the same as a school ranked, say, 100 or lower? So let's just say this person went to, Harvard.
Sure. I thought you'd pick Duke.
That's usually what I pick.
In fact, that's why I thought this question sort of stood out to you, is because you and I both have a resume that I think this speaks to. We went to places that are sort of notoriously academically brutal, where I saw some people at other places that probably had an easier go of it.
That's entirely the case. It wasn't Harvard that this person actually had selected, but they had selected a very good, well-regarded institution. Certainly one of the better ones in the country by reputation. Could have been Duke, could have been Harvard, could have been, who knows. So the question, though, is like, is it really seen the same? Like, don't I get a bonus for having gone to a great school? And I know that that is something that is really easy to want to believe in, because a lot of times you pay more for those schools, especially if they're private. And certainly it's weighed in the sense of, like, they know the competition at those schools is really good. But the thing that always makes me, one thing that happens every year is that Harvard releases like their list of all the schools that people attended. A lot of schools do this, but for some reason I always look at Harvard's to see where they took people from. And if it was really the case that you're getting this big bump from having gone to some great undergraduate school, everybody on their list would be from some great big name school. Yet when you look at that list, you discover, sure, they're there. Duke's on their list, Columbia's on their list, Harvard, all those schools. But here's just a few of the schools, John, that they accepted students from for the class of 2025. Brock University.
Yep, you've already lost me. I don't know what that even is.
I pride myself on knowing schools. Like, I know a lot of undergraduate schools. Brock was beyond me. I was like, okay, I'm not familiar with them. But somebody from Brock got into Harvard, so congrats to that person. But notice how Harvard didn't say, oh, they didn't go to Yale, so we're not going to include them. They looked at their performance. They looked at more than just the school name. Here's another one of my favorite schools, not Duke, but Drake. Mm-hmm. And I love Drake because when I was a high school senior, I lived in Minneapolis. And so I obviously went to Duke, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to Duke. And apparently got around in my class, I went to a pretty big high school, that I was going to Drake. And so for a couple days, people kept saying to me like, hey, jerk, enjoy Iowa. And I was like, what the heck are they talking about, Iowa? And then I discovered they thought I was going to Drake, and I was like, no, and then I gave them the grief right back for being geographically and institutionally illiterate. But Drake's on that list, a relatively small school in Iowa. Gordon College, another school I'm not familiar with. Mount Allison University. These are all people who went to these schools who got into Harvard.
Yeah.
St. Olaf, which is a small school in Minnesota that I am familiar with.
Okay.
And then Wheaton, another school in Illinois that I'm familiar with as well. But these are not national institutions. And when you look at this, yeah, they realize and appreciate that you had competition if you went to a school like Harvard. But that doesn't mean that you're elbowing other people out of the way. Elsewhere in life, you will. You will get that advantage. I think we know that. But that is not happening in the same way that maybe the average person thinks is the case when they attend those schools. You get so many other advantages from attending those schools. I still remember the first job interview I had when I told them I went to Duke. They're like, you got the job.
Yeah.
I didn't have to do much after that. Of course, I probably wish I hadn't gotten that job, but that's a whole other issue.
I thought you didn't have to do much after that at the job. But I thought you meant.
Job. I don't want it.
Let me actually add to this a related question that I think is so closely tied that it's almost just a part two, which is, does my undergraduate major make a difference? And I don't want to start throwing majors out so that we rank or compare them, but I think it's pretty obvious and evident to anyone who's gone through college that there are easier tracks to take and more challenging, more demanding ones. Would my 3.6 in a harder major get seen equally as a 3.8 in something easier? And sadly, my take on this is that we're still just back to a flat numbers game. What you got at your undergraduate school is a GPA, regardless of where you went or what you studied. That number is kind of what defines you, much more than reputation, much more than the course load.
Yeah, your Mount Allison 4.0 is going to outweigh, Stanford's 3.8.
Yep.
And Stanford's widely thought to have serious grade inflation issues. But you're right. It becomes the numbers. The machine, the calculator doesn't care where you went to school. It only cares about the final number. I do think some majors, like STEM majors, get a slight advantage because oftentimes they're pointing in a different direction than, say, transactional law or
Political
kind of like
science.
litigation.
Yeah.
They're going towards some kind of like technical science thing, patent, what have you, where there's like, all right, we understand what they're doing. Okay, let's move on to the next question here.
Right.
Why don't you read this one, John?
Happily. This is a personal statement question that, again, we saw a consultant of ours get asked. And here it is. I've not had any prior experience working in a law firm, which seems to be a common background among many law applicants. Is this a deal breaker? I like the way they phrased it as a deal breaker because no. But is this a concern? Is this a problem or a setback? It might be a more fair way to ask this. I'd still answer no. To me, I don't think schools would look at this, and you can tell me you feel otherwise. I don't think schools would necessarily look at this as a huge asset or a huge loss. But what I know is a lot of people who actually spend some time around lawyers, particularly working in a law firm before going to law school or choosing what to do in law school, they've learned enough about the industry and the profession that it informs their choices in a really useful way.
Yeah. I'd say you're completely accurate there. You have gotten your feet wet in the field, and you at least have some understanding of the pathway that you're choosing. That can never be a bad thing. Then again, if we had 100 applicants and all 100 had worked in a law firm, where's the diversity in that? Where's the different experiences that are coming through? So is it a deal breaker? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Maybe you were doing something else that was amazing that will stand out in an entirely different way. Having worked in a law firm can certainly be valuable. I think it's a good default way if you're like, look, I'm not involved in like starting my own charity for water conservation, where you're not like, I have some big thing that everybody's just jumping on a train for. In this particular case, that's a great strategy. But if you don't have it, there's plenty of things that people have done with their time elsewhere that are just equally amazing and interesting and would be welcome in a law school class. So deal breaker, absolutely not. There are different ways to play this game, different ways to climb the mountain.
For sure. Yeah, they also use the phrase seems to be a common background among law school applicants. I'm not sure I agree with that either. I think you'd find it's a pretty small minority, frankly, who've had law firm work experience.
Yeah, it's not a majority. I mean, the most common background among all these applicants is that they went to university.
Right.
That's common
true.
touch point.
Yeah.
Beyond that, things are quite diverse. Let's move on to some addenda questions. I always like these because I'm a big fan of writing an addendum to address all sorts of situations that might be troublesome, unusual, gaps in records, things like that. So, and some of these are a little bit more towards kind of the side of almost where I put a trigger warning on them almost. Be like, we're going to talk about some topics that might involve references to like abuse, violence, what have you, where people have asked questions about how do I handle this? And obviously we've sanitized all the references from anything that is too much, but also anything that would be personally identifying.
Right.
In this. And some of them are relatively mild, but there's 3 questions here. I think 2 of them are a little bit more than just the basics. So here's the first one, John. When I was an undergraduate student, I had a health situation that forced me to withdraw from a semester of courses. After that withdrawal, I made all A's. I need help writing an addendum that explains these circumstances. And to me, it's a good question. This is exactly what an addendum is for. Because they have something on their record that has to be addressed. There is a break in the process. And ultimately, putting your whole personal statement on this topic doesn't sound like a great thing because it might be negative.
Yeah.
I had to go through this. Ultimately, there's a positive story here. So even then, it wouldn't be the end of it. But do you really want your whole picture of you as a person to be, I had to withdraw from school and I came back better than before? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So to me, I would say write an addendum about this and really go into how, this was an unfortunate situation. It radically affected me. The great thing that came out of it is I was able to get over it. I am better now. There's no expectation that this will actually recur. and it affected my GPA, and that's why my GPA is lower. But if you look at before and after the health issues, you can see afterwards I'm 4.0. I can do this.
Yeah.
I think that becomes a real positive statement that supplements the application and supports it strongly.
Yeah, I mentioned the idea before of like patterns and trends in schools trying to figure out kind of who you are based on trajectories. And I think you touched on the two key things there really well, Dave. One is that this is not an ongoing health issue, from what I can tell. Schools will see this as a fluke as opposed to a trend or defining thing. And then secondly, they came back so strong with a 4.0 that it actually shows a pattern of overcoming this type of adversity, this type of difficulty, if it did come up again. So I don't see anything negative really in that, although I'm sure it was rough to go through.
Yeah. This is one of those things where kind of like overcoming it becomes part of the story. Whether or not you want to make it your main story is up to you. I mean, that's what our consultants do in terms of talking about how strong is this? Is this the direction you want to take? But remember, you're creating a portfolio of experiences and ideas that you're conveying to the committee. You have to figure out which ones are the strongest, the most important, the ones that need to be front and center, and the ones that are more kind of like the supporting pillars of your application.
Yeah.
This could go either way, although I'd probably tend to think that this might be more of a supporting pillar as opposed to the main pillar.
I agree 100%.
Let's go to the next one, which comes in as a question about personal statements, but is really, to me, one that shows how writing an addendum can really kind of take care of something without having to put it into your main statement. This person says they have multiple experiences that really don't connect in their life. And they talk a little bit about various academic work they've done, charity work they've done, how they were involved in a startup. And the first thing that I would say to somebody like that is, do you have to connect them? Is it necessary to connect them? And the answer from a personal statement standpoint is no.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to explain your resume at all times. Sometimes you want to, but as a personal statement, the last thing I want to do is read, I went from this experience to this experience to that experience. We call it the glorified resume.
Right.
And it is you already have a resume. I don't want to hear the recitation of further details of your resume. What I always tell students like this is there anything in any of these experiences that's extremely pivotal or revealing? Something that you could draw out as your personal statement. And if you need to address something else from any of these issues, then put that in a different statement, into a YX statement or an addendum of some sort. This person also goes on to say, I'd really appreciate some additional information on how to discuss something that happened to me that was sensitive. And it was related to college. I'm not going to put any of the details in here.
Right.
Without bringing in trauma and kind of like the negative experience, how do I work that into my personal statement? And my first answer to that is you don't work something like that into your personal statement. Either it becomes your personal statement or it becomes a separate statement. A personal statement is not a Christmas tree that you can hang ornament after ornament on. A personal statement is one big ornament. It has to all work together, but it is not a variety of experiences. I'd have to know more about this person's situation to be able to say, hey, this is the right way to go about it. And they might not even be comfortable talking about it, and that's okay too. Nobody needs to be pushed over the edge emotionally because they're like, I feel like I have to tell strangers this story. Sometimes it's comforting to do so. Sometimes it can feel, cleansing almost, but it's not something you have to do. But this could go either way. This could be their personal statement. It could be a separate statement that explains something else in their record, maybe a dip in performance or something along those lines. Notice, though, that there's no definitive answer. You have options. You have to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of your application and figure out how you want to tell your story.
Yeah, what could you talk about instead obviously plays a role here. I like that Christmas tree, I guess, metaphor. I've likened it before to like a personal statement's not the orchestra, it's an instrument. So you need to pick the instrument you play best, the one that you think people would most want to listen to. I think I might like your analogy better. But it gets to the same point, which is it can get so diffuse and so kind of multifaceted that you actually lose the impact of it.
You only have a couple pages.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you're going to get more mileage out of talking about one experience deeply or 3 or 4 experiences superficially?
Superficially, yeah.
Yeah. It's obviously the one experience is typically going to be that way. And people can draw 2 or 3 experiences in if there's a common thematic thread that's running through them. I'm not getting that from this person's kind of commentary. And there seems like there's a lot going on. And when there's a lot going on, usually extra statements come through.
Yeah. I like that.
All
There's
right.
a related question that we got. Do you want to read this one too? You want me to do it?
I'll read it.
Okay.
I graduated from college a few years ago. After college, I enrolled in a graduate school program and I was assaulted and dropped out after receiving very little support from the school. So there is a major gap in my resume while I took time off, and I'm having difficulty figuring out how to address this. First off, sorry to this person that happened. Obviously, that sounds awful. I do think it's great that they went and took the time to, go through therapy and work on themselves and to try to grapple with it. I'm not going to say overcome because I'm not sure you overcome anything like that, but
Sure.
I'm not overly experienced there. I love the idea, though, that this person is like, I just need to figure out how to word it. I know I'm going to address it, and I need to address it. And that's exactly the case. There's a gap in your record. It doesn't matter why you have a gap in your record. The school will want to know.
Mhm.
A law school will read that and be like, well, what happened here? Gone for 6 months, gone for 12 months. They'll want to know, just like, your Aunt Ellen would want to know. They'd be like, well, what have you been doing for the last year? It's the same type of thing. So I think this person comes in with a very intelligent view of it. They're also saying it's not going to be the focus of my personal statement. I don't want to make something negative that happened to me what the committee thinks of me. And that's their personal call. It can work, but it doesn't have to be the way that you go with this. But these kinds of things, especially when they're sensitive like this, they can be really difficult to talk about. I'm very sympathetic to these types of situations. They take longer to write because they're so emotionally fraught.
Yeah, it's delicate and charged. I will say, if you could call a silver lining here, that this happened in graduate school as opposed to undergraduate. So if there were to be a time for some type of interruption or self-care or this type of thing to come up, probably better that it happened a little later and didn't affect your undergraduate GPA, presumably. Looking for some kind of redeeming aspect to this.
It's sad that we have to actually frame it that way.
I know.
Like, oh, we're glad this. Wouldn't say we're glad, but it was more beneficial to you that it happened later as opposed to earlier because law schools care so much about your undergrad GPA. You make a really good point. There's also a condemnation of the system.
Of course, yeah. And I don't think either one of us are trying to say, like, you're lucky this happened when it did. But I do think it's not false to say the timing could have been worse. And I hope that doesn't come off as callous, because I certainly don't intend to be.
It doesn't. Not to me. What that sounds like to me is, okay, looking for something that would be at least not having the worst scenario here from an application-only standpoint also tells you that the system is messed up.
Yeah.
I thought for years that the way they handle graduate school experiences are bad. I hate the way they handle transcripts from undergraduate with retaking classes. I have a lot of complaints about the way the process works. And maybe we'll see a little bit less of a stranglehold on these types of GPA and LSAT issues now that U.S. News has been punched in the face with the rankings kind of like redo and the kind of like the complaints of the law schools and kind of the newly weighted GPA and LSAT elements. I would love to see that be the case because the system doesn't have to be so stupidly focused on numbers.
Yeah.
Let's go to some questions that'll certainly reflect back onto like addenda, personal statements, and so forth, but they're almost still these are really in the vein of like character and fitness questions. Mm-hmm. People who had issues. Let's try that first one.
Yeah, I'll do this one. Another that came in through consultants, which is clearly the theme. It's a short one. I'd like to discuss being laid off from my most recent job for economic reasons, in parentheses. And again, without any more details than that, I think you and I are probably going to be necessarily vague in some of the advice here. I don't know the nature of the job. I don't know how long they worked there. I don't know what they've done since. I don't even know the specific economic reasons beyond what I would just presume or guess. But it's like everything else that we're going to talk about here. This is probably one for an addenda if it shows such a gap in your resume that it becomes, I call it suspicious or unclear. That's how I think of a lot of these schools. The perspective they have is like, would this trigger a question? If so, get ahead of it. answer it in advance. So again, I don't know enough of the circumstances here to suggest that that's the case, but assuming that it is, let's say that you were out of work for a year and it was a little bit conspicuous, then address it. I think if the last, say, 3 to 4 years have taught us anything, it's that economic reasons are clearly at the heart of a lot of the things that have happened to people beyond their control.
Yeah, if there's a certain benefit to the time that we live in, it's that a number of people over the last several years have gone through a similar experience. And so schools are very used to seeing this.
Yeah.
Somebody losing their job is not maybe the red flag that it used to be, or was for some period of time. This isn't the 60s and 70s anymore. It's not like one company for your whole life.
Right. I was thinking it's been 90 years since it was so relatable to be kind of out of control of your own work experience.
Yeah. So I think the schools now understand a little bit more. And also we're seeing faster movement even in the job markets with people having issues like this. I think it's very telling that this person said, look, it was economic reasons, because that actually changes the direction. If you were laid off for performance reasons or behavioral issues, you now are in a position where you're going to have to address that to some extent. This maybe not, depending upon how it is. It depends on what the record is ultimately. But when it is economic reasons, you can immediately default to that. Be like, this wasn't something I did. This was out of my control. Especially if the company was fairly substantial and they went down, it might even be a known thing for a lot of people. So I would say this is one of those things where sure, it's probably easier to address than you think it is, because you just address it head on and talk about what you did afterwards and how it was really not anything was related to anything you did. I find that one to be a relatively straightforward one.
Yeah, and a brief one too. Keep in mind, if you can keep these to a paragraph or two and still get your point across, still get your explanatory point across, that's always preferable. Well, a lot of what I see with these addenda and certainly personal statements is people write a novel that doesn't need to be written.
Yeah, I like to see a page on the addendum if possible. Let's go to another one that's more character and fitness. This person says the biggest, concern about my application is that I have withdrawn from around 5 courses throughout my collegiate career. The person later retook these courses and got A's on those courses. And, the decision to withdraw was really made not because of like an academic problem, it was other things going on. And so ultimately, they want to know how to address it, if it should be addressed at all. And of course, that last question is the first one to answer. Should it be addressed?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You got 5 W's. It's not normal.
Yeah.
At least not
what I'd be
most
curious
of the
to
time.
see too here is what this actually does to an LSAT GPA. We know that schools very often treat withdrawals or incompletes differently than LSAC's little algorithm does. That would certainly be the first bit of advice here is like, what does your GPA actually look like when LSAC submits it for law schools? They may be in for some heartbreak here, unfortunately.
Yeah, the W, if it was an F followed by an A, you get both of them.
Yeah.
A W followed by an A, I think, is just the A. I can't remember because they keep changing the rules. Because the W, I don't think counts for anything. But in that particular case, this is the transcript thing that I was talking about. When LSAC, through their CAS service, standardized transcripts, if you take a class and fail it, say you take Math 101, you fail it, you come back the next semester, you retake it, you get an A. The school usually counts the A only. They're like, oh, you got an A in the class. That was your best final grade. So they count that, and they just discount the F entirely. Unfortunately, when you get to law school applications, you discover that LSAC doesn't care what your school does.
Yeah.
And they calculate their own GPA for you. And they include the A. So, all right, bonus. They include the F too, because it's on your record.
Yep.
They're total jerks about this. I've complained about it, I don't know, endlessly over the years. I'm extremely annoyed by the fact that they don't follow what the school does or just take the highest.
Yeah.
It's stupid. And I have no problem saying that. But here's the thing. There's 2 parts to this. Number one, the 5 W's, you need to address that.
Yeah.
If it affected your grades in some particular way that I'm not recalling off the top of my head, or if some of these weren't entirely W's or there was a grade associated with them, then you definitely need to explain that part as well. But this is an easy one. Explain the W's and explain any additional grade change if there was one.
And again, looking for silver linings, the fact that they went back and took all 5 of those withdrawals again and pulled A's in each, that to me is like the perfect redemption story really here. Is there were some things I had to withdraw from, but I'm not a quitter. In fact, look what happened when I tried again. I think there's a way to spin that I think is an attribute or affirmative.
Absolutely. And there's also the context of it. Were all these W's in one semester?
Yeah.
Okay, something happened, obviously. Talk about what happened. I get the feeling it wasn't, though. And if it's intermittent, like a W here and a W there, that starts to look almost like non-committal. So I would think about that aspect. This is, again, as almost always is the case. It's like when people write me questions about admissions, I'm like, it's really hard for me to answer that because I need so much more information. And Twitter isn't the format for that. That's why we have a whole professional service that does this, so we can get all this information and say, oh, because a lot of times there's some little piece right at the end that comes in and we're like, that makes everything fit together.
Yeah, the devil's truly in the details when it comes to this stuff.
All right, John, let's do some LSAT questions.
Got it. Finally.
Just kind of go through those easy ones, because obviously the LSAT's a big part of this. And we're not going to talk about LSAT prep or anything. We're really going to talk about how LSAT scores fit inside the application process. So this kind of goes back almost to what we started with, but is more focused on the LSAT, the admissions idea. This person says, my LSAT score is on the lower end of the spectrum for some of the schools I want to attend, yet my GPA academic background is very strong from a very well-regarded top 20 school. I don't know which schools I should target. I also have strong letters of recommendation if that helps. And now notice that this question comes in without specifics. And so I don't know entirely what we're looking at. The person says that their LSAT score is on the lower end of the spectrum. So the question is how do you proceed with somebody like this when they're choosing schools, knowing that this is the case?
Like you and I almost have to create hypotheticals for this discussion to even make sense. And when you're on the lower end of the spectrum, are you a point below the 50th percentile at the schools? Are you below their 25th? What does this actually mean? GPA is very strong with a good academic background in school. What was your GPA? I consider a 3.7 pretty strong, but top 10 schools probably don't. So
they don't.
Yeah, there's too much mystery here for my comfort. However,
that's a really good, prefacing remark here. Keep all this uncertainty in mind.
If it feels like we tap dance a little bit on this one, it's for good reason, frankly. We don't
give me details.
We don't have
stop tap dancing.
Exactly. Can't hear the music. But what I would say is this: it never hurts to take a few long shots. In fact, I encourage people to do this, especially if you have some softs that could move the needle. Like they talk about great recommendations. They could churn out a really good personal statement, hopefully with our help, which seems to be where this is headed. So I don't think hope is lost from the fact that they have an LSAT that's on the lower end of the spectrum. The question I think I would ask them, aside from the numbers themselves, Dave, is why don't you take the LSAT again?
Yeah. That would be one question I would ask. I would probably start out along these lines and say, let's look at your LSAT score and your GPA, and let's figure out where your LSAT score is around the 25th or so and where your GPA is around the 75th. Let's see what kind of schools where you're a splitter and we have the opportunity to at least have some offsets here. One of the comments I make about splitters is that it changes every year.
Yeah.
Splitters can have great success in law school applications because a school might say, all right, you got a high LSAT and I need a high LSAT. Or a different school might say, you got a high GPA and I need a high GPA.
Yeah.
They use splitters to fill in the gaps.
If I'm going to get nitpicky, this is technically a reverse splitter situation.
Yeah.
So if anybody's out there doing
both.
research and feels like they're in this category, yeah, I know you are. I didn't want anybody out there Googling splitters because this sounded familiar and realizing this is not them at all.
Yeah, I'm talking
Sorry.
about reverse splitters and splitters and even super splitters in the same exact way here, where the numbers are really out of alignment. But when you take a look at the situation, they can really have a great deal of success, but it changes from year to year. Maybe one year Vanderbilt's like, we need a few extra high LSAT scores, splitter high LSAT people, ahoy. The next year they're like, oh, we're a little low on the GPA. So they're like, go get those high GPA people. That's why it can be really unpredictable. So if you are a splitter or a reverse splitter, usually what you do is you open up the number of schools that you apply to and add a few because you expect to have more variable results. At the same time, if you're below the 25th at a school on both those metrics, your chances are not good of getting in. And so I would start here and I would say, all right, let's look at these schools where you might be able to have a 75th on one mark and a 25th on another mark. And then I would turn around and I would say, those schools, are they satisfactory? If you got into the best of them, so to speak, in your opinion, would you be satisfied with it? And if they're like, yeah, I would love that. All right, fine. Let's proceed and work on the rest of the application. If that person comes back and says, no, I won't go to any of those schools, that's when I turn around, John, and ask your question.
Yeah.
All right, so do we need to talk about taking the LSAT again? Because that appears to be the problem. What happened?
Yeah. There's a second concern that could prompt that advice as well, which is, all right, I think I could probably get into a school that I'd be okay with, but I know I'm going to end up paying full sticker.
Totally.
Frankly, I need some money back. I need a discount. At which point, it's the LSAT sitting there staring you in the face as your opportunity to make some money.
It's the one thing you can change.
Yep. So that's always on my mind, especially this time of year where people start to worry. This hasn't come up in this conversation yet, interestingly, but they start to worry about, like, is it too late in the cycle? There's this urgency that people feel to apply. When, in my mind, I sit back and I think, another 2 or 3 points in January or even February, probably worth the wait, as we've discussed more times than I could count.
There's a question coming up about that.
Oh, okay.
Which I think we'll address. It's 2 questions away here that we'll go through on this, where I do think the idea needs to be addressed because I feel very strongly about that. There's 2 things I want to talk about. That's one of them. The other thing I want to talk about is like score preview and canceling scores and how it looks. These are 2 of the things that we're going to end with here that I'm very interested in. Before we get to that, kind of right before the ending here. Here's a question. I've taken the LSAT 5 times. Am I dead in the water due to just that? I love that question.
I think the way that's like phrased, yeah.
The fear inside of it is, I might have done this too many times. Am I out? Good news for you, friend. No. First off, 5 times is not that big of a deal because we're coming out of an era where I regularly saw people who had taken the LSAT 6, 7, 8 times. I've talked about people that I've known who've gotten into T14 schools with 9 takes. And that was because there was a period of time where there was no limitation on taking the LSAT. And everybody knew that only the high score was being counted by these schools, obviously pandemic related.
Yeah.
And so people just took the LSAT over and over. They could take it at home. They're like, taking it again. Didn't like my score, taking it again. So schools in very recent past have seen an astronomically large number of LSAT takes. This is totally different than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, scores were averaged. People taking the LSAT 3 times was like, that was rare. 4 or more, hardly ever.
The diminishing returns on 4 averages, frankly, is like, why bother? But now with high scores in play, and the window of time you're referencing, I believe, was the 2020, where it was just a free-for-all. You could take the test as many times as you wanted, no limits, no caps. And they've just changed the policy again, where you can now take it more times in a shorter window as well. So 5 times to me doesn't have nearly the same kind of pejorative connotation that it might have had, even 10 years ago.
Yeah, 5 by itself is not an issue.
Yeah.
And one of the questions we'll come up with is about how the pattern of scores relates to things, but we'll get to that too. So at least first part of that question is, taking it 5 times, am I out? Absolutely not. It's not that big of a deal. Do I want people to take it 5 times? No, honestly, no. I'd prefer they take it 1 time, destroy the test, get the best possible score they could ever get, and then just leave. We've said this before. Our favorite moment is when someone says, I'm done with the LSAT. I'm like,
one and done.
Outstanding. Off to applications. Happy to help there too. All right, John. So let's go to another request that came in.
Before we move on, I'm gonna throw you what I think is probably a softball here.
Oh.
Swing away. Would you rather see someone take it 4 times and stop, or take it a 5th time and go up, say, 2 more points?
Generally, is that their highest score? Is it at the very
Yeah.
end?
The 5th time is the best they've ever done, but I'm going to make it marginally, so 2 points, maybe 3. Like, at what point would you say it's not worth the score gain to add another one of these to your record? Maybe that's a different way to phrase it.
Yeah. Would I prefer their fifth be more points? Yes. I would still say yes, take it.
Completely in agreement.
Yeah, and we'll talk.
Especially these days, man. You could skate by with a little less of a competitive edge, several years ago. It's just not the reality anymore. Those extra points are worth, in my opinion, more than any concerns about the number of takes.
This is the next question. Let's just read it.
Cool.
I have 3 LSAT sittings and 2 scores on file. All right. So they've got 2 actual scores and a cancel. My practice testing is in the upper 170s. My current high score is 171. This is below the median at several of my target schools. So, an enviably good score, still below where they're looking at. This is the part of the question that interests me the most. I'm concerned about the prospect of a 4th retake and whether this would harm my application more than help. Now, let's just say they go out and they perform at their lower end of their performance range. They get a 174, maybe a 175. Which is better for your application? Not having that 175 or having that 175?
With a 4th attempt.
Yeah.
I feel like I stole the thunder of this because now it's so obvious what I'm going to say based on what I said last question. But the score. Get the higher score.
Having it on the record, like having the higher score is better in all cases because it's the black and white determiner there. Oh, they took it a 4th time and they got that higher score? You can see how, especially at this point, it's like I was asking about the 2 points. I didn't really ask you where they were, but contextually, this person is saying, I'm below the median. Get to the median. I've heard multiple admissions deans say that is like, look, getting to the median at our school just makes our life easier because we no longer have to think about that aspect. We no longer have to compensate for something else that you're doing. We can check that box and move to the other boxes and start looking at positives. So that 4th retake, I don't care about it. Those higher score, yes. Now let's just say they went out and they've got that 2 scores and 2 cancels.
Okay.
I also don't care about that.
So
2 cancels is nothing.
This 4th attempt doesn't improve on their 171, so they cancel it, which would very likely be the right call there. 2 cancels, 2 keeps, and a 171. You're in no worse shape, in my opinion.
You know what? If I'm looking at you from an application standpoint, I'm like, the person thinks they're better than a 171 and they're trying to prove it. It's just not happening. And hopefully there's not some kind of like technical meltdown or all these kinds of things. But if there was, I would write an addendum that says, hey, I have these cancels on record, but there were technical issues or whatever the issues might have been that possibly led to that, if in fact there were issues. You don't have to just accept it. Oh, I got 2 cancels. I need to call it a day. If LSAC has screwed you over through bad proctoring, through technical issues, through server breakdowns, blame it all on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're not there. There's no penalty to them. And it's definitely true if it happened. And it's happened to so many people. I'm always like, gosh, they're costing you points. And yet you just are going to sit back and not and take it. You're not going to blame them when they deserve the blame. If I look at somebody's record like this and they say, I really was doing quite well in my practice tests and I ran into some problems during the exam and had to cancel it, that's not your fault. You shouldn't take the blame for it.
Yeah, this is going to be a sad sentence, but schools are very attuned to the fact that the last 4 years of digital LSAT administrations have been kind of rocky. Sometimes they've been catastrophic. Sometimes they've gone pretty smooth. Sometimes they've gone fairly smoothly, but there hasn't been a test in 4 years that multiple people weren't badly affected. Schools know this. So if that happened to you, certainly it qualifies for an addendum. But even if it didn't, schools, I think, are given to some presumption of like they might have just had a lousy circumstance. The proctor didn't know what was going on, or the test crashed.
Exactly.
Schools know that things out there these days aren't just running as expected. So I think they give people the benefit of the doubt with cancellations here.
I think they do too. And of course, we also have a unique scenario these days, at least unique to us, because I didn't start out in a world where this was possible, but that is score preview.
Score preview, yeah.
Score preview gives you this incredible ability to see your score. And one of the things that, happened prior to score preview was that people would say, and they were right, schools are now taking the high score. They only have to report the high score to the ABA. So you can take the LSAT 5 times and the highest score is going to be the one. Might a few old line professors at Yale who are reading applications who are 85 years old complain about that? Yeah, they might. You might have to take that chance. The rest of the modern LSAT and admissions world knows that taking the LSAT multiple times is actually something that almost everybody does, in part because of the technical issues. Mm-hmm. But because of the way the high LSAT score has become so valued, and it's thought that it's just the way that it is, people look at it. One of the things that I've seen over the last several years is people saying, well, you don't even need score preview. You don't need to use it. And I don't feel that way. I actually feel very strongly that you should be aggressive in your use of score preview. If it's financially feasible, I always tell people to get it.
Sure.
Because you don't know what is going to happen. I've seen people walk in saying, I'm going to get a 175, walk out saying, I feel great, and they get a 165, and they're demoralized. It's now on their permanent record, and they feel as if in that particular case, their expectations were so much higher than the reality, they feel like they're failures. And it can happen when somebody walks in thinking they're going to get a 155 and they get a 145. It doesn't matter. It's like when you underperform to your expectations in your prior track record. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, should I cancel? How much should I cancel? I'm very scared of canceling. Mm-hmm. Remember, an unknown cancellation score is just that. It is unknown. Yeah. Nobody knows what you canceled. LSAC does, but they're not reporting it. The chance of you getting a higher score is worth taking. And if you can't get that higher score, it's okay to cancel if you haven't met kind of like where you're at. One of the examples here is, my current high score is 171. What if I take it the 4th time? It's bad to take it 4 times. No, do it. Well, then they go to the next question. Well, what if I don't get a 171? My response is always, don't think negatively. Mm-hmm. So don't even entertain that possibility. And know that if you didn't get the 171, you're going to cancel it. Oh, isn't that bad? No. I'd prefer it not to be the case, but I prefer the opportunity to post a higher score because even a point higher would be worth it, especially where that person was at. And I've been getting a lot of questions on Twitter, direct messaging about this. And so I really wanted to talk about the fact that usually to me, if you've already posted a higher score, I'm telling students not to accept lower scores.
Yeah, me too.
Cancel them. And somebody had asked me about this, and I was like, let me explain to you how context matters. So I'm going to give you the scenario of two students who are going to have ultimately the same 4 scores, but the order in which they appear is entirely different. And the choices that I would make as a student for each one are entirely different. So are you ready, John?
Yeah, let's do this. I wonder what 4 scores you're going to pick for these two. For this one unfortunate person.
No, it's going to be real round. Let's imagine that we have a student whose first test is 155. They accept that score. The next test is 160. They knew they could do better. All right, now you've posted 5 points better. I'm accepting that score. The third test, they go out because they're like, I still can do better. They get a 165. And then their last score is 170. In this case, you can see how a student would go from test to test and accept all of them. They would have a 4 score track record from 155 up to 170. It would look like they're a fighter who kept trying, who believed in themselves. There's almost like an unwritten history in that score progression that's like this person really like powered through it and mastered the LSAT.
Yeah, just hearing those numbers right now, I'm impressed for this person you've made up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 15-point increase over 4 attempts. That's amazing. It's fantastic.
And very solid. If you were to complain about that, you'd say, well, you should have waited before you took it the first time till you were better.
Yeah.
Okay. I get that criticism. I don't put a whole lot of stock in it personally because I'm like, boy, everybody's not clairvoyant. I'm sorry, Mr. Law School professional or Yale professor, we can't always know that we're going to get a 170. Sometimes we have to work our way up the mountain as opposed to just being like, I'm going to go climb Everest today and it's going to be successful.
Born on third, as they say.
Yeah, totally. Let's now compare that to this next person who, without saying, let's just say these are the scores they would have gotten, and then we can talk a little bit about what I would do in a situation like this. Their first score is 170.
Okay. Oh, I know where this is going.
Right. Yeah, well, I'm taking that probably as 170 is pretty good. So that's my opener. I'm taking 170. They go out the next time, they post a 165. Then they go out the third time, they post a 160. And we're not saying that they're keeping these scores or canceling. We're just saying this is what they would have gotten. And then their last and fourth time is 155. These are the same four scores, John, as the first person, but they are now reversed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we're taking all four of those scores?
Oh, I certainly hope not.
No.
No, not if you've got the option to erase, well, really the final three.
I mean, the high's still 170, though.
Yeah.
What does it matter?
It'd be a 170 and then 3 successive cancellations. But that's a hell of a lot better scenario than a 170 and a 15-point drop.
Yeah, the thing is the contents here are exactly the same. One of these stories looks really positive. And of course, people will immediately be like, but you told us that they take the high score. I'm like, no, they tell us that. They're still human. Do you want them to see that? What's worse, though, is that the person taking this test sees that.
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to, at least in my experience, very heavily impact the way they view themselves, which I hate. It's a test, man. It's like 2.5 hours. Don't let it change your vision of yourself. You have many skills and abilities outside the screen of the LSAT.
Yeah.
But in a case like this, keeping all those scores actually paints a picture of something's going wrong and you didn't recognize it. Why did you keep taking it? And this goes to show that it's not just about the actual numbers, because the numbers here are identical. The pattern, when they happen, contextually makes a huge difference. We probably should have started with this, John, because it's probably one of the most important points in the entire podcast.
It might be. I hope people stuck around for it, because it's certainly the most interested I've been in an hour. Well, no, you made this up, but it's really, really interesting. And you're right, too. I'm glad you addressed that this does seem to run almost counter in the face of the idea of, well, if they just take the highest score, who cares? But as we both said multiple times, schools are really sensitive to tendencies and trends. They look for patterns, and they certainly look for strange patterns that would raise questions. If I saw those four scores, 170 dropping 5 points each time down to a 155 at the fourth, I'd have a ton of questions. First, why'd you keep some of these? Second, what happened? How did you regress?
Questions.
Yeah, how did you regress this far?
I still know you have the ability to score 170, but now you've raised questions I didn't need to have before. And
you had an ability to score 170. That's the best I could say there. You framed it present tense, and I'm like,
they still have that ability. It's just it's a little bit back. But I see so many conversations about score preview that are like, you don't need it, just accept it. Only the high matters. I'm like, let's use a rather extreme example that I admittedly created to kind of like highlight how it is not all the same. Scores here are all the same, but the nature of the choices that you would make in each case are very different. And if you're sitting out there and you're like, I have multiple scores on my record, or I'm going to take the January test and I need to think about what it is that I might do, this is what that conversation is for, is to understand, well, how does it look? For me, I often think that if you have a score coming in that is lower than the one you already have on the record, I'm thinking I might cancel that very strongly. It depends. There are circumstances where you might not. 178 and 176, I'm not going to worry about it. Those two scores, that 2-point drop is negligible at that level. But not many people are in that kind of a luxurious situation where they can focus on that. And by the way, if you have a 178, why are you taking the LSAT again anyway? So you shouldn't be doing that. So there are, of course, exceptions to everything. But that whole thing, for me, I've become much more aggressive in recommending not only the use of score preview, but also the use of score cancellation to control your record. I think the cancellations on your record are not as negative as lower scores because they don't know why. The unknown is a lot less threatening than the known lower score.
Yep.
End of story.
End of story, although I'm still going to ask a question to follow it up, so maybe not the end. I feel like you've changed your tune on this a little bit over the years, which that's kind of what smart people do in the face of more information. So there's no judgment in that. But would you say that your opinion on this has shifted even a little bit in terms of like the use of cancellation, the use of score preview? Because I think for a long time, you and I are both pretty inclined to just be like, keep it, who cares?
I would say this, my opinion changed when score preview started to become heavily, became available. I was like, that has changed the nature of the game because now you don't have the uncertainty. Before you had to play the uncertainty game. Did you get a 170 or did you get a 160? Maybe if you feel good about it, let's go and see. Now we don't have that uncertainty. Because score preview has taken away the uncertainty of how you've done, that has changed the advisement. 5-10 years ago, the advisement would have been different.
Yeah.
We were playing a different game. The rules changed, so that has affected how I see this. I've just happened to notice that a lot of my compatriots are still locked into the keep every score mindset. And I'm like, I don't feel that way.
Interesting.
And I don't mind telling people that.
I guess maybe my question could have been phrased as, has your opinion on this, if it has changed based on score preview or based on schools and the behavior of like admissions committees? And it sounds to me like it's score preview that's changed it. I think that's probably the case for me as well.
Score previews change it. Also, the limitation in the number of times you can take the LSAT has made it so that there's not like these huge messy records with 7 or 8 takes. Now that there's fewer takes, I don't think cancellations are as big of a deal. You don't need as many LSAT scores. You just need 1 or 2 out there. And then obviously the high sits. I'd rather have somebody with 2 LSAT scores and 2 cancellations than 4 scores and there's of wildly differing results.
Or a pattern of decline, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, or a pattern of decline. So, the first case where every time it improves, okay, look, that's not what always happens. I mean, the reason people take the LSAT again is because they didn't like what happened the last time.
Right.
Or they think they can improve upon the last time. That's really its own episode, overall, this kind of question of it. But it is not just score preview, but it is the limitation in the number of LSATs that people can take. Those two things have changed the way I think it's perceived, and certainly the way I perceive it. The high score, if you have 2 or more scores, is still the one they use for admissions purposes. Just don't give them additional ammunition to think about it at all with other lower scores. That's the takeaway.
I like it. It is its own episode. In fact, we're so committed to this idea of like the unique situation of retakers that you and I are building this component into a future iteration of the LSAT course that's going to launch early next year. We're actually making a version of this course or a subcomponent of the course that's going to be geared specifically to people taking the test again, which I think is sort of novel in the industry. I'm really excited about it. You've come up with some ingenious things for those people to incorporate.
You put the pressure on. Yeah, we might as well talk about that.
It's not out yet, but it's coming.
Especially for people who are taking it in, say, August 2024 or later.
Yeah.
The revised on-demand course that will launch in August, in February, which
you just scared me to death. Like, oh no, what happened?
in February 2024, pointed at the August 2024 LSAT, will be focused on all sorts of different tracks. There'll be like core tracks, but there'll also be like high scoring tracks. There'll be retaker tracks where we've got constant content, live classes daily, addressing various parts of this, a huge on-demand library. It'll be a really cool course. I know you and I have been working on it already since the Logic Games change came through, and we're just completely repointing our courses. We're going to move away from the lesson format, which works so great when you have 3 major topics like games, reasoning, and reading comp. It does not work as nearly as well with just 2, the LR and the RC. So we're changing the way we're delivering our course and everything. But more on that in a future episode, John. But there will be a special retaker component to that course focused solely on those people retaking the LSAT.
Yeah, I didn't want to take us too far down that road, but it did remind me of the fact that that's of a particular kind of point of interest for us at the moment.
Very much so.
Yeah.
All right, John. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating as well. And we're always happy to receive feedback or questions on anything we talked about today. And you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, I hope this was useful. Everybody stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon. Happy holidays.